there were no indigenous people in Antarctica. That is one of the few things about the continent that has never been seriously disputed. No native population, no tribal memory, no bones older than the ice itself. So tell me why, in 1899, someone wrote 3 children into an expedition log, not as stowaways, not as a clerical error. The entry is deliberate, descriptive, and placed between routine notations about weather and supply inventory, as if whoever wrote it considered the presence of these children to be, at that moment, simply another fact of the day. I want to be precise about which expedition I am referring to, because precision is the only thing that keeps this from collapsing into speculation. The Southern Cross expedition, led by Carsten Borchgrevink, wintered at Cape Adare on the Antarctic continent in 1899, the first team ever to do so deliberately. Borchgrevink's shore party consisted of 10 men. This is documented, cross-referenced, and unambiguous. Their names, their roles, their nationalities, all of it is accounted for in multiple independent records held across 3 countries. 10 men went south. The shore party records confirm 10 men. And then there is the log entry. The standard explanation, when scholars have encountered the entry at all, is simple enough. Field journals from expeditions of that era were often informal and imprecise. Children could refer to young sled dogs, or be a nickname for junior crew members. These were common informal conventions in polar expedition writing. That explanation is not wrong. It is in fact the first place I went. I held it for a long time, because it is genuinely reasonable. Borchgrevink's men were young, several were in their 20s. Informal crew nicknames appear throughout expedition literature of the period, often without further explanation. But here is the detail that will not stay in place. The entry does not say the children in passing. It describes them. 3 individuals described as small in stature, moving with familiarity across the ice shelf near the camp perimeter. 1 entry, 1 paragraph, and then nothing. The subject is never raised again. It is the silence that follows that changes everything. Not the entry itself. The entry alone can be explained away in half a dozen ways. But a crew of 10 men, wintering on a continent no human had ever overwintered on before, apparently encountered something, wrote it down once, and collectively chose to never mention it again. Think about what that silence actually requires. These were scientists and sailors, men who documented everything: barometric pressure, wind shifts, the behavioural patterns of penguins. Borchgrevink's published account from 1901, first on the Antarctic continent, is meticulous. It runs to hundreds of pages. 3 children do not appear in it once. I have read that account carefully. My first instinct was the obvious one. The entry was apocryphal, a later edition, perhaps a forgery. That is a clean solution. But handwriting analysis conducted by archivists at the Scott Polar Research Institute is consistent with the expedition's known primary recorder. The hand is right, the ink is right, the paper is right. Now I want to move carefully, because this is the point at which it becomes easy to reach, to start pulling in peripheral material and call it a pattern. I am going to resist that. What I will do instead is stay inside the same story, the same cast, the same documented timeline. Nicolai Hanson was the expedition's zoologist. He died at Cape Adare in October 1899, the first person ever buried on the Antarctic continent. His death is documented and his grave still exists, but his personal research notebooks, which he kept separate from the expedition's main log, have never been fully published or examined in their entirety. Hanson's notebooks were transferred to the Natural History Museum in Christiania, now Oslo. After the expedition returned, a portion was summarized in a zoological monograph in 1902. The originals were catalogued, and then, sometime between 1902 and 1920, two of the notebooks were reclassified as non-scientific personal records and removed from the main research collection. I want to be fair about this. Reclassification of personal materials in archival collections is ordinary institutional housekeeping. It happens constantly, for mundane reasons. The absence of a document from a public catalogue is not evidence of anything except archival decision-making. I know that. I am not arguing otherwise. What I am noting is the timing. The reclassification occurs in the years following Robert Falcon Scott's discovery expedition, which returned in 1904, an expedition that also overwintered near the Antarctic coast, produced meticulous records, and contains at least one navigational log entry that researchers have flagged as internally inconsistent in its account of a coastal survey. The inconsistency in Scott's log has been attributed to surveying error, the kind of small positional mistake that is routine under Antarctic conditions. I am not citing it as proof. I am citing it as a data point. Two separate expeditions, two separate national institutions, two separate records with the same quiet irregularity embedded in the same geographic region. And then there is William Spears Bruce. His Scotia expedition of 1902 to 1904 surveyed the Weddell Sea, established a meteorological station on Laurie Island, and produced some of the most scientifically rigorous records of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Bruce was meticulous, careful, and deeply skeptical of romanticism in polar science. Bruce's expedition journal, held at the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, contains a passage from March 1903 that has been noted occasionally in polar history circles, not widely, but enough to have been flagged. It describes from a distance a dark shape along a coastline that his team could not account for in subsequent surveys. He writes that it appeared to move. Bruce offers no theory. He records it, notes that the light conditions made precise observation impossible, and moves on. That is exactly what a careful scientist does. Alone, it would mean nothing, but it is not alone. It is the third separate expedition, the third national institution, the third anomalous notation embedded inside the same decade and the same geographic corridor. Here is where I want to slow down considerably, because this is the part of the argument easiest to dismiss. If these records were being suppressed or coordinated, who was doing it? Borchgrevink was Norwegian, Scott was British, Bruce was Scottish. Their institutional homes were entirely separate, in some cases professionally competitive with one another. There was no shared authority over these records. No single government body controlled simultaneous access to all three archives. No single individual could have reclassified Hanson's notebooks in Oslo while also influencing editorial decisions about Bruce's journal in Edinburgh. The logistical impossibility of a named conspiracy is real, and I take it seriously. But here is the thing about institutional silence. It does not require coordination to become uniform. It requires only shared interest. The scientific community of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration was small, deeply interconnected, and heavily invested in the narrative of Antarctic as a pristine, uninhabited wilderness awaiting human discovery. That narrative had real value. It justified funding. It justified national prestige. It justified the entire conceptual framework of polar exploration as a project of discovery rather than contact. an anomaly that threatened that narrative, that suggested the continent had not been empty, had perhaps never been entirely empty, would not need to be actively suppressed to disappear. It would only need to be treated as an error, filed under the wrong category, left out of the published summary, described in institutional memory as imprecise field notation until no one remembered to look at it again. Silence of this kind is not a conspiracy. It is the natural physics of institutional self-preservation. There is one more thread I want to pull carefully. When Borchgrevink's published account appeared in 1901, it was reviewed prominently in the scientific press. One review, published in the Geographical Journal, the official publication of the Royal Geographical Society, is notable for what it spends an unusual amount of space dismissing. The reviewer devotes 2 paragraphs to arguing against what he calls sensational additions to polar literature, a phrase he does not define or attribute to any specific passage in Borchgrevink's book. The review is otherwise laudatory. That digression has no visible target in the published text. It is rebutting something that is no longer there to be read. A review arguing against content that does not appear in the book it is reviewing. Either the reviewer was confused, which is possible, or the published text had already been altered between the manuscript and the printed edition, and the reviewer had seen an earlier draft. Those are the only 2 explanations I can construct from the available record. I need to stop and name the counter-argument I find most persuasive, because intellectual honesty demands it. The most compelling objection to everything I have laid out is simple. Antarctica in 1899 was an environment that would have made human survival without advanced technology essentially impossible. The continent averages -57 degrees Celsius in winter. There is no indigenous food chain capable of sustaining a human population. There is no shelter except what the ice provides, and the ice is lethal. The idea that any group, children or adults, could have been living there independently defies the most basic understanding of physiology. That is a serious objection. I hold it seriously. The survival argument alone should close the case. And it does close the case. If we assume that the civilization being discussed survived the way we imagine they must have. But that assumption carries its own weight, and it is worth examining before we let it settle. We know almost nothing about prehistorical polar habitation, because we have never seriously looked. The geological record of Antarctica is almost entirely inaccessible, buried under an ice sheet averaging 2 kilometers in depth. We have not examined what lies beneath that ice the way we have examined other continents. We have barely begun. The science of subglacial environments has only recently revealed that beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet there are more than 400 liquid water lakes, entire ecosystems operating in permanent darkness, under enormous pressure, sustained by geothermal heat from below. The ice is not solid, it is layered, and what it covers we do not fully know. I want to be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying that children of a lost civilization were discovered living on the Antarctic ice in 1899. I am not claiming a coordinated cover-up spanning 3 nations and 5 institutions. I am not saying the official record is deliberately false. What I am saying is narrower and, I think, more defensible. Within the documented record of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, using only real documents, real expeditions, and real institutional archives, there is a cluster of anomalies that share a specific character. They appear once, are described once, and then they stop. One-time notations, one-time sightings, one-time archival reclassifications, one-time editorial digressions aimed at invisible targets, Each one has an individual explanation. Each individual explanation is reasonable. But the frequency, and more than the frequency, the uniform disappearance that follows each instance, begins to resemble something other than coincidence and something quieter than conspiracy. It resembles the kind of silence that settles when a community of professionals shares, without naming it, a consensus about what is appropriate to discuss. Not censorship, not suppression, something more durable, the collective decision made by no one in particular to let certain questions fall out of focus and stay there. I keep returning to the expedition log entry itself. 3 individuals, small in stature, moving with familiarity across the ice near the camp perimeter. The word familiarity is the one I cannot release. Familiarity implies relationship with a place. It implies belonging. It is not the word you use for something that is simply lost or out of place. Whoever wrote that entry, and it was written by a real hand on a real ship in the coldest human habitation that had ever existed on Earth at that point, made a deliberate linguistic choice. They did not write strange figures. They did not write unknown shapes. They wrote about something that appeared to know exactly where it was, and then 10 men, surviving together in total isolation in the most extreme environment on Earth, decided as a group to never mention it again, not in letters home, not in published accounts, not in the private diaries that were later archived and partially opened to researchers. The subject closed, completely, without explanation anywhere in the surviving record. You can explain any single one of these facts in isolation. The sled dog theory, the metaphor theory, the archival error, the editorial confusion, each one holds on its own terms. You can feel the weight of reasonable doubt pressing against the more unsettling alternative. I understand that impulse. I share it more than I am comfortable admitting. But I want to offer one final thought, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer it. The continent of Antarctica was, according to everything we believe, entirely uninhabited for the whole of human history. No settlements, no migrations, no crossing, no cultural memory. That belief is not based on excavation. It is based on absence. It is based on the absence of evidence. Evidence we could not have collected, even if we had tried, from a continent whose surface we have barely touched, and whose depths we have not begun to understand. The absence of evidence in Antarctica is not evidence of absence. It is, more precisely, evidence of ice. That is all it has ever been. 3 children moving with familiarity across the ice at Cape Adare in 1899, written down by someone who believed it was worth recording, silenced afterward by 10 men who apparently agreed, collectively, that it was not worth repeating, and somewhere beneath 2 kilometers of ice, 400 liquid lakes, geothermal corridors, sealed environments we had not imagined until recently. I am not telling you what was there. I am not certain enough, and I would not claim it even if I were. What I am telling you is that the question has a shape, and the shape of this question has been bothering me in the way that only a question with a real answer tends to do. Someone, 126 years ago, sat in a frozen camp at the edge of the known world and watched something move across the ice with the ease of someone who had always been there. They chose to write it down. I think they did it because they were afraid no one else would. The log still exists. The entry is still there, and the question it contains has never been formally raised by any polar historian working in any archive in any country, which means either everyone who has encountered it has found the same reasonable explanation, or everyone who has encountered it has made the same quiet decision not to ask